Chapter 55. The March following. Bathsheba Boldwood. We pass rapidly on into the month of March, to a breezy day without sunshine, frost, or dew. On Yalbury Hill, about midway between Weatherbury and Casterbridge, where the turnpike road passes over the crest, a numerous concourse of people had gathered, the eyes of the greater number being frequently stretched afar in a northerly direction. The groups consisted of a throng of idlers, a party of javelin men, and two trumpeters, and in the midst were carriages, one of which contained the High Sheriff. With the idlers, many of whom had mounted to the top of the cutting formed for the road, were several Weatherbury men and boys, among others Poorgrass, Coggan, and Cain Ball. At the end of half an hour a faint dust was seen in the expected quarter, and shortly after a travelling carriage, bringing one of the two judges on the western circuit, came up the hill and halted on the top. The judge changed carriages whilst a flourish was blown by the big-cheeked trumpeters, and, a procession being formed of the vehicles and javelin men, they all proceeded towards the town, excepting the Weatherbury men, who, as soon as they had seen the judge move off, returned again home to their work. "Joseph, I seed you squeezing close to the carriage," said Coggan as they walked. "Did you notice my Lord Judge's face?" "I did," said Poorgrass. "I looked hard at en, as if I would read his very soul, and there was mercy in his eyes, or, to speak with the exact truth required of us at this solemn time, in the eye that was towards me." "Well, I hope for the best," said Coggan, "though bad that must be. However, I shan't go to the trial, and I'd advise the rest of ye that bain't wanted to bide away. 'Twill disturb his mind more than anything to see us there staring at him as if he were a show." "The very thing I said this morning," observed Joseph. "Justice is come to weigh him in the balances. I said in my reflectious way, and if he's found wanting, so be it unto him." And the bystander said, "Hear, hear. A man who can talk like that ought to be heard, but I don't like dwelling upon it, for my few words are my few words, and not much, though the speech of some men is rumoured abroad as though by nature formed for such." "So 'tis, Joseph. And now, neighbours, as I said, every man bide at home." The resolution was adhered to, and all waited anxiously for the news next day. Their suspense was diverted, however, by a discovery which was made in the afternoon, throwing more light on Boldwood's conduct and condition than any details which had preceded it. That he had been from the time of Greenhill Fair until the fatal Christmas Eve in excited and unusual moods was known to those who had been intimate with him, but nobody imagined that there had shown in him unequivocal symptoms of the mental derangement which Bathsheba and Oak, alone of all others at different times, had momentarily suspected. In a locked closet was now discovered an extraordinary collection of articles. There were several sets of ladies' dresses in the piece, of sundry expensive materials, silks and satins, poplins and velvets, all of colours which, from Bathsheba's style of dress, might have been judged to be her favourites. There were two muffs, sable and ermine. Above all, there was a case of jewellery, containing 4 heavy gold bracelets and several lockets and rings, all of fine quality and manufacture. These things had been bought in Bath and other towns from time to time, and brought home by stealth. They were all carefully packed in paper, and each package was labelled Bathsheba Boldwood, a date being subjoined 6 years in advance in every instance. These somewhat pathetic evidences of a mind crazed with care and love were the subject of discourse in Warren's Malthouse when Oak entered from Casterbridge with tidings of sentence. He came in the afternoon, and his face, as the kiln glow shone upon it, told the tale sufficiently well. Boldwood, as everyone now supposed he would do, had pleaded guilty, and had been sentenced to death. The conviction that Boldwood had not been morally responsible for his latter acts now became general. Facts elicited previous to the trial had pointed strongly in the same direction, but they had not been of sufficient weight to lead to an order for an examination into the state of Boldwood's mind. It was astonishing, now that a presumption of insanity was raised, how many collateral circumstances were remembered to which a condition of mental disease seemed to afford the only explanation, among others, the unprecedented neglect of his corn stacks in the previous summer. A petition was addressed to the Home Secretary, advancing the circumstances which appeared to justify a request for a reconsideration of the sentence. It was not numerously signed by the inhabitants of Casterbridge, as is usual in such cases, for Boldwood had never made many friends over the counter. The shops thought it very natural of a man who, by importing direct from the producer, had daringly set aside the first great principle of provincial existence, namely that God had made country villages to supply customers to country towns, should have confused ideas about the Decalogue. The prompters were a few merciful men, who had perhaps, too, feelingly considered the facts latterly unearthed, and the result was that evidence was taken which it was hoped might remove the crime, in the moral point of view, out of the category of wilful murder, and lead it to be regarded as a sheer outcome of madness. The upshot of the petition was waited for in Weatherbury with solicitous interest. The execution had been fixed for 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning, about a fortnight after the sentence was passed, and up to Friday afternoon no answer had been received. At that time Gabriel came from Casterbridge Gaol, whither he had been to wish Boldwood good-bye, and turned down a by-street to avoid the town. When he passed the last house he heard a hammering, and lifted his bowed head as he looked back for a moment. Over the chimneys he could see the upper part of the Gaol entrance, rich and glowing in the afternoon sun, and some moving figures were there. They were carpenters, lifting a post into vertical position within the parapet. He withdrew his eyes quickly, and hastened on. It was dark when he reached home, and half the village was out to meet him. "No tidings," said Gabriel wearily, "and I'm afraid there's no hope. I've been with him more than 2 hours." "Do you think he really was out of his mind when he did it?" said Smallbury. "I can't honestly say that I do," Oak replied. "However, that we can talk of another time. Has there been any change in mistress this afternoon?" "None at all." "Is she downstairs?" "No, and getting on so nicely as she was too. She's but very little better now again than she was at Christmas. She keeps on asking if you be come, and if there's news, till one's wearied out with answering her. Shall I go and say you've come?" "No," said Oak. "There's a chance yet. But I couldn't stay in town any longer, after seeing him too. So Laban is here, isn't he?" "Yes," said Tall. "What I've arranged is that you shall ride to town the last thing to-night, leave here about 9, and wait a while there, getting home about 12. If nothing has been received by 11 o'clock to-night, they say there's no chance at all." "I do so hope his life will be spared," said Liddy. "If it's not, she'll go out of her mind too. Poor thing, her sufferings have been dreadful. She deserves anybody's pity." "Is she altered much?" said Coggan. "If you haven't seen poor mistress since Christmas, you wouldn't know her," said Liddy. "Her eyes are so miserable that she's not the same woman. Only 2 years ago she was a romping girl, and now she's this." Laban departed as directed, and at 11 o'clock that night several of the villagers strolled along the road to Casterbridge and waited his arrival. Among them Oak, and nearly all the rest of Bathsheba's men. Gabriel's anxiety was great that Boldwood might be saved, even though in his conscience he felt that he ought to die, for there had been qualities in the farmer which Oak loved. At last, when they all were weary, the tramp of a horse was heard in the distance. First dead, as if on turf it trode, then clattering on the village road, in another pace than forth he rode. "We shall soon know now, one way or other," said Coggan, and they all stepped down from the bank on which they had been standing into the road, and the rider pranced into the midst of them. "Is that you, Laban?" said Gabriel. "Yes, 'tis come. He's not to die. 'Tis confinement during Her Majesty's pleasure." "Hooray!" said Coggan, with a swelling heart. "God's above the devil yet." Chapter 56. Beauty in Loneliness, after all. Bathsheba revived with the spring. The utter prostration that had followed her low fever from which she had suffered diminished perceptibly when all uncertainty upon every subject had come to an end. But she remained alone now for the greater part of her time, and stayed in the house, or at furthest went into the garden. She shunned every one. even Liddy, and could be brought to make no confidences, and to ask for no sympathy. As the summer drew on, she passed more and more of her time in the open air, and began to examine into farming matters from sheer necessity, though she never rode out or personally superintended as at former times. One Friday evening in August she walked a little way along the road, and entered the village for the first time since the sombre events of the preceding Christmas. None of the old colour had as yet come to her cheek, and its absolute paleness was heightened by the jet black of her gown, till it appeared preternatural. When she reached a little shop at the other end of the place, which stood nearly opposite to the churchyard, Bathsheba heard singing inside the church, and she knew that the singers were practising. She crossed the road, opened the gate, and entered the graveyard. The high sills of the church windows effectually screened her from the eyes of those gathered within. Her stealthy walk was to the nook wherein Troy had worked at planting flowers upon Fanny Robin's grave, and she came to the marble tombstone. A motion of satisfaction enlivened her face as she read the complete inscription. First came the words of Troy himself. Erected by Francis Troy in beloved memory of Fanny Robin, who died October 9th, 18 something, aged 20 years. Underneath this was now inscribed in new letters: in the same grave lie the remains of the aforesaid Francis Troy, who died December 24th, 18 something, aged 26 years. Whilst she stood and read and meditated, the tones of the organ began again in the church, and she went with the same light step round to the porch and listened. The door was closed, and the choir was learning a new hymn. Bathsheba was stirred by emotions which latterly she had assumed to be altogether dead within her. The little attenuated voices of the children brought to her ear in distinct utterance the words they sang without thought or comprehension. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. Bathsheba's feeling was always to some extent dependent upon her whim, as is the case with many other women. Something big came into her throat, and an uprising to her eyes, and she thought that she would allow the imminent tears to flow if they wished. They did flow, and plenteously, and one fell upon the stone bench beside her. Once that she had begun to cry for she hardly knew what, she could not leave off for crowding thoughts she knew too well. She would have given anything in the world to be, as those children were, unconcerned at the meaning of their words, because too innocent to feel the necessity for any such expression. All the impassioned scenes of her brief experience seemed to revive with added emotion at that moment, and those scenes which had been without emotion during enactment had emotion then. Yet grief came to her rather as a luxury than as the scourge of former times. Owing to Bathsheba's face being buried in her hands, she did not notice a form which came quietly into the porch, and on seeing her first moved as if to retreat, then paused and regarded her. Bathsheba did not raise her head for some time, and when she looked round her face was wet, and her eyes drowned and dim. "Mr. Oak!" exclaimed she, disconcerted. "How long have you been here?" "A few minutes, ma'am," said Oak respectfully. "Are you going in?" said Bathsheba, and there came from within the church as from a prompter: "I loved the garish day, and, spite of fears, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years." "I was," said Gabriel. "I'm one of the bass singers, you know. I have sung bass for several months." "Indeed, I wasn't aware of that. I'll leave you then." "Which I have loved long since and lost a while," sang the children. "Don't let me drive you away, mistress. I think I won't go in tonight." "Oh no, you don't drive me away." Then they stood in a state of some embarrassment, Bathsheba trying to wipe her dreadfully drenched and inflamed face without his noticing her. At length Oak said, "I've not seen you, I mean spoken to you, since ever so long, have I?" But he feared to bring distressing memories back, and interrupted himself with, "Were you going into the church?" "No," she said. "I came to see the tombstone privately, to see if they had cut the inscription as I wished. Mr. Oak, you needn't mind speaking to me, if you wish to, on the matter which is in both of our minds at this moment." "And have they done it as you wished?" said Oak. "Yes. Come and see it, if you have not already." So together they went and read the tomb. 8 months ago, Gabriel murmured when he saw the date. It seems like yesterday to me. And to me as if it were years ago. Long years, and I had been dead between. And now I am going home, Mr. Oak. Oak walked after her. "I wanted to name a small matter to you as soon as I could," he said with hesitation. "Merely about business, and I think I may just mention it now if you'll allow me." "Oh yes, certainly." "It is that I may soon have to give up the management of your farm, Mrs. Troy. The fact is, I'm thinking of leaving England. Not yet, you know. Next spring." "Leaving England?" she said in surprise and genuine disappointment. "Why, Gabriel, what are you going to do that for?" "Well, I've thought it best," Oak stammered out. "California is the spot I've had in mind to try." "But it is understood everywhere that you are going to take poor Mr. Boldwood's farm on your own account." "I have had the refusal of it, 'tis true, but nothing is settled yet, and I have reasons for giving up. I shall finish out my year there as manager for the trustees, but no more." "And what shall I do without you? Oh, Gabriel, I don't think you ought to go away. You've been with me so long, through bright times and dark times, such old friends as we are, that it seems unkind almost. I had fancied that if you leased the other farm as master, you might still give a helping look across at mine. And now, going away." "I would have willingly." "Yet now that I am more helpless than ever, you go away?" "Yes, that's the ill fortune of it," said Gabriel in a distressed tone. "And it is because of that very helplessness that I feel bound to go. Good afternoon, ma'am," he concluded, in evident anxiety to get away, and at once went out of the churchyard by a path she could follow on no pretence whatever. Bathsheba went home, her mind occupied with a new trouble, which, being rather harassing than deadly, was calculated to do good by diverting her from the chronic gloom of her life. She was set thinking a great deal about Oak, and of his wish to shun her, and there occurred to Bathsheba several incidents of her latter intercourse with him, which, trivial when singly viewed, amounted together to a perceptible disinclination for her society. It broke upon her at length as a great pain that her last old disciple was about to forsake her and flee. He who had believed in her and argued on her side when all the rest of the world was against her, had at last, like the others, become weary and neglectful of the old cause, and was leaving her to fight her battles alone. 3 weeks went on, and more evidence of his want of interest in her was forthcoming. She noticed that instead of entering the small parlour or office where the farm accounts were kept, and waiting or leaving a memorandum, as he had hitherto done during her seclusion, Oak never came at all when she was likely to be there, only entering at unseasonable hours when her presence in that part of the house was least to be expected. Whenever he wanted directions he sent a message, or note with neither heading nor signature, to which she was obliged to reply in the same off-hand style. Poor Bathsheba began to suffer now from the most torturing sting of all, a sensation that she was despised. The autumn wore away gloomily enough amid these melancholy conjectures, and Christmas Day came, completing a year of her legal widowhood, and 2 years and a quarter of her life alone. On examining her heart, it appeared beyond measure strange that the subject of which the season might have supposed suggestive, the event in the hall at Boldwood's, was not agitating her at all, but instead an agonizing conviction that everybody abjured her, for what she could not tell, and that Oak was the ringleader of the recusants. Coming out of the church that day, she looked round in hope that Oak, whose bass voice she had heard rolling out from the gallery overhead in a most unconcerned manner, might chance to linger in her path in the old way. There he was, as usual, coming down the path behind her, but on seeing Bathsheba turn, he looked aside, and as soon as he got beyond the gate, and there was the barest excuse for a divergence, he made one and vanished. The next morning brought the culminating stroke. She had been expecting it long. It was a formal notice by letter from him that he should not renew his engagement with her for the following Lady Day. Bathsheba actually sat and cried over this letter most bitterly. She was aggrieved and wounded that the possession of hopeless love from Gabriel, which she had grown to regard as her inalienable right for life, should have been withdrawn just at his own pleasure in this way. She was bewildered too by the prospect of having to rely on her own resources again, It seemed to herself that she never could again acquire energy sufficient to go to market, barter, and sell. Since Troy's death, Oak had attended all sales and fairs for her, transacting her business at the same time with his own. What should she do now? Her life was becoming a desolation. So desolate was Bathsheba this evening that, in an absolute hunger for pity and sympathy, and miserable in that she appeared to have outlived the only true friendship she had ever owned, she put on her bonnet and cloak and went down to Oak's house just after sunset, guided on her way by the pale primrose rays of a crescent moon a few days old. A lively firelight shone from the window, but nobody was visible in the room. She tapped nervously, and then thought it doubtful if it were right for a single woman to call upon a bachelor who lived alone, although he was her manager, and she might be supposed to call on business without any real impropriety. Gabriel opened the door, and the moon shone upon his forehead. "Mr. Oak," said Bathsheba faintly. "Yes, I am Mr. Oak," said Gabriel. "Who have I the honour— Oh, how stupid of me, not to know you, mistress." "I shall not be your mistress much longer, shall I, Gabriel?" she said in pathetic tones. "Well, no, I suppose. But come in, ma'am. Oh, and I'll get a light," Oak replied with some awkwardness. "No, not on my account." "It is so seldom that I get a lady visitor that I'm afraid I haven't proper accommodation. Will you sit down, please? Here's a chair, and there's one too. I'm sorry that my chairs all have wood seats and are rather hard, but I was thinking of getting some new ones." Oak placed 2 or 3 for her. "They are quite easy enough for me." So down she sat, and down sat he, the fire dancing in their faces and upon the old furniture, all a sheening with long years of handling, that formed Oak's array of household possessions, which sent back a dancing reflection in reply. It was very odd to these two persons, who knew each other passing well, that the mere circumstance of their meeting in a new place and in a new way should make them so awkward and constrained. In the fields or at her house there had never been any embarrassment, but now that Oak had become the entertainer their lives seemed to be moved back again to the days when they were strangers. "You'll think it strange that I have come, but—" "Oh, no, not at all." "But I thought— Gabriel, I have been uneasy in the belief that I have offended you, and that you are going away on that account. It grieved me very much, and I couldn't help coming." "Offended me? As if you could do that, Bathsheba." "Haven't I?" she asked gladly. "But what are you going away for else?" "I am not going to emigrate now, you know. I wasn't aware that you would wish me not to when I told 'ee, or I shouldn't have thought of doing it," he said simply. "I have arranged for Little Weatherbury Farm, and shall have it in my own hands at Lady Day. You know I've had a share in it for some time. Still, that wouldn't prevent my attending to your business as before, hadn't it been that things have been said about us." "What?" said Bathsheba in surprise. "Things said about you and me? What are they?" "I cannot tell you." "'Twould be wiser if you were to, I think. You have played the part of mentor to me many times, and I don't see why you should fear to do it now." "It is nothing that you have done this time. The top and tail of it is this, that I am sniffing about here, and waiting for poor Boldwood's farm, with a thought of getting you some day." "Getting me? What does that mean?" "Marrying of 'ee, in plain British. You asked me to tell, so you mustn't blame me." Bathsheba did not look quite so alarmed as if a cannon had been discharged by her ear, which was what Oak had expected. "Marrying me? I didn't know it was what you meant," she said quietly. "Such a thing as that is too absurd, too soon, to think of by far." "Yes, of course it's too absurd. I don't desire any such thing. I should think that was plain enough by this time. Surely, surely you be the last person in the world I think of marrying. It's too absurd, as you say." "Too soon were the words I used." "I must beg your pardon for correcting you, but you said too absurd. And so do I." "I beg your pardon too," she returned with tears in her eyes. "Too soon, that's what I said. But it doesn't matter a bit, not at all. But I only meant too soon. Indeed, I didn't, Mr. Oak, and you must believe me." Gabriel looked her long in the face, but the firelight being faint there was not much to be seen. "Bathsheba," he said tenderly and in surprise, and coming closer. "If I only knew one thing, whether you would allow me to love you and win you and marry you after all. If I only knew that!" "But you never will know," she murmured. "Why?" "Because you never ask." "Oh, oh," said Gabriel, with a low laugh of joyousness. "My own dear—" "You ought not to have sent me that harsh letter this morning," she interrupted. "It shows you didn't care a bit about me, and were ready to desert me like all the rest of them. It was very cruel of you, considering I was the first sweetheart that you ever had, and that you were the first I ever had, and I shall not forget it." "Now, Bathsheba, was ever anybody so provoking?" he said, laughing. "You know it was purely that I, as an unmarried man, carrying on a business for you as a very taking young woman, had a proper hard part to play. More particular that people knew I had a sort of feeling for 'ee, and I fancied, from the way we were mentioned together, that it might injure your good name. Nobody knows the heat and fret I have been caused by it." "And was that all?" "All." "Oh, how glad I am I came!" she exclaimed thankfully, as she rose from her seat. "I have thought so much more of you since I fancied you did not even want to see me again. But I must be going now, or I shall be missed. Why, Gabriel," she said with a slight laugh, as they went to the door, "it seems exactly as if I had come courting you. How dreadful!" "And quite right too," said Oak. "I've danced at your skittish heels, my beautiful Bathsheba, for many a long mile and many a long day, and it is hard to begrudge me this one visit." He accompanied her up the hill, explaining to her the details of his forthcoming tenure on the other farm. They spoke very little of their mutual feeling, pretty phrases and warm expressions being probably unnecessary between such tried friends. Theirs was that substantial affection which arises, if any arises at all, when the two who are thrown together begin first by knowing the rougher sides of each other's character, and not the best till further on, the romance growing up in the interstices of a mass of hard prosaic reality. This good fellowship, a camaraderie, usually occurring through similarity of pursuits, is unfortunately seldom superadded to love between the sexes, because men and women associate not in their labours, but in their pleasures merely. Where, however, happy circumstance permits its development, the compounded feeling proves itself to be the only love which is strong as death, that love which many waters cannot quench, nor the floods drown, besides which the passion usually called by the name is evanescent as steam. Chapter 57. A foggy night and morning. Conclusion. The most private, secret, plainest wedding that it is possible to have. These had been Bathsheba's words to Oak one evening, some time after the event of the preceding chapter, and he meditated a full hour by the clock upon how to carry out her wishes to the letter. A licence. Oh yes, it must be a licence, he said to himself at last. Very well then, first a licence. On a dark night, a few days later, Oak came with mysterious steps from the surrogate's door in Casterbridge. On the way home he heard a heavy tread in front of him, and overtaking the man, found him to be Coggan. They walked together into the village until they came to a little lane behind the church, leading down to the cottage of Laban Tall, who had lately been installed as a clerk of the parish, and was yet in mortal terror at church on Sundays when he heard his lone voice among certain hard words of the Psalms, whither no man ventured to follow him. "Well, good night, Coggan," said Oak. "I'm going down this way." "Oh?" said Coggan, surprised. "What's going on to-night, then? Make so bold, Mr. Oak." It seemed rather ungenerous not to tell Coggan, under the circumstances, for Coggan had been true as steel all through the time of Gabriel's unhappiness about Bathsheba, and Gabriel said, "You can keep a secret, Coggan." "You've proved me, and you know." "Yes, I have, and I do know. Well, then, mistress and I mean to get married to-morrow morning." "Heaven's high tower! And yet I've thought of such a thing from time to time, true I have. But keeping it so close! Well, there, 'tis no concern of mine, and I wish 'ee joy o' her." "Thank you, Coggan. But I assure 'ee that this great hush is not what I wish for at all, or what either of us would have wished if it hadn't been for certain things that would make a gay wedding seem hardly the thing. Bathsheba has a great wish that all in the parish shall not be in the church looking at her. She's shy like, and nervous about it. In fact, so I be doing this to humour her." "Ay, I see. Quite right too, I suppose I must say. And you be now going down to the clerk?" "Yes. You may as well come with me." "I'm afeard your labour in keeping it close will be throwed away," said Coggan as they walked along. "Labe Tall's old woman will horn it all over the parish in half an hour." "So she will. Upon my life I never thought of that," said Oak, pausing. "Yet I must tell him to night, I suppose, for he's working so far off and leaves early." "I'll tell 'ee how we could tackle her," said Coggan. "I'll knock and ask to speak to Laban outside the door, you standing in the background. Then he'll come out, and you can tell your tale. She'll never guess what I want en for, and I'll make up a few words about the farm work as a blind." This scheme was considered feasible, and Coggan advanced boldly and rapped at Mrs. Tall's door. Mrs. Tall herself opened it. "I wanted to have a word with Laban." "He's not at home, and won't be this side of 11 o'clock. He've been forced to go over to Yalbury since shutting out work. Shall I do quite as well?" "I hardly think you will. Stop a moment." And Coggan stepped round the corner of the porch to consult Oak. "Who's t'other man, then?" said Mrs. Tall. "Only a friend," said Coggan. "Say he's wanted to meet mistress near Church Hatch to-morrow morning at 10, said Oak in a whisper. "That he must come without fail, and wear his best clothes." "The clothes will floor us as safe as houses," said Coggan. "It can't be helped," said Oak. "Tell her." So Coggan delivered the message. "Mind, het or wet, blow or snow, he must come," added Jan. "'Tis very particular indeed. The fact is, 'tis to witness or sign some law work about taking shares with another farmer for a long span of years. There, that's what it is, and now I've told thee, Mother Tall, in a way I shouldn't have done if I hadn't loved thee so hopeless well." Coggan retired before she could ask any further, and next they called at the vicar's in a manner which excited no curiosity at all. Then Gabriel went home and prepared for the morrow. "Liddy," said Bathsheba, on going to bed that night, "I want you to call me at 7 o'clock tomorrow, in case I shouldn't wake." "But you always do wake afore then, ma'am." "Yes, but I have something important to do, which I'll tell you of when the time comes, and it's best to make sure." Bathsheba, however, awoke voluntarily at 4, nor could she by any contrivance get back to sleep again. About 6, being quite positive that her watch had stopped during the night, she could wait no longer. She went and tapped at Liddy's door, and after some labour awoke her. "But I thought it was I had to call you," said the bewildered Liddy, "and it isn't 6 yet." "Indeed it is. How can you tell such a story, Liddy? I know it must be ever so much past 7. Come to my room as soon as you can. I want you to give my hair a good brushing." When Liddy came to Bathsheba's room her mistress was already waiting. Liddy could not understand this extraordinary promptness. "Whatever is going on, ma'am?" she said. "Well, I'll tell you," said Bathsheba, with a mischievous smile in her bright eyes. "Farmer Oak is coming here to dine with me to-day." "Farmer Oak, and nobody else? You two alone?" "Yes." "But is it safe, ma'am, after what's been said?" asked her companion dubiously. "A woman's good name is such a perishable article that—" Bathsheba laughed with a flushed cheek, and whispered in Liddy's ear, although there was nobody present. Liddy stared and exclaimed, "Souls alive, what news! It makes my heart go quite bumpety bump." "It makes mine rather furious too," said Bathsheba. "However, there's no getting out of it now." It was a damp, disagreeable morning. Nevertheless, at 20 minutes to 10 o'clock, Oak came out of his house, and went up the hillside with that sort of stride a man puts out when walking in search of a bride, and knocked at Bathsheba's door. 10 minutes later a large and a smaller umbrella might have been seen moving from the same door, and through the mists along the road to the church. The distance was not more than quarter of a mile, and these two sensible persons deemed it unnecessary to drive. An observer must have been very close indeed to discover that the forms under the umbrellas were those of Oak and Bathsheba, arm in arm for the first time in their lives, Oak in a greatcoat extending to his knees, and Bathsheba in a cloak that reached her clogs. Yet, though so plainly dressed, there was a certain rejuvenated appearance about her, as though a rose should shut and be a bud again. Repose had again incarnadined her cheeks, and having at Gabriel's request arranged her hair this morning as she had worn it years ago on Norcombe Hill, she seemed in his eyes remarkably like a girl of that fascinating dream, which, considering that she was now only 3 or 4 and 20, was perhaps not very wonderful. In the church were Tall, Liddy, and the parson, and in a remarkably short space of time the deed was done. The two sat down very quietly to tea in Bathsheba's parlour in the evening of the same day, for it had been arranged that Farmer Oak should go to live there, since he had as yet neither money, house, nor furniture worthy of the name, though he was on a sure way towards them, whilst Bathsheba was, comparatively, in a plethora of all three. Just as Bathsheba was pouring out a cup of tea, their ears were greeted by the firing of a cannon, followed by what seemed like a tremendous blowing of trumpets in front of the house. "There," said Oak, laughing, "I knew those fellows were up to something, by the look on their faces." Oak took up the light and went into the porch, followed by Bathsheba with a shawl over her head. The rays fell upon a group of male figures gathered upon the gravel in front, who, when they saw the newly married couple on the porch, set up a loud hurrah, and at the same moment bang again went the cannon in the background, followed by a hideous clang of music from a drum, tambourine, clarinet, serpent, hautboy, tenor viol, and double bass, the only remaining relics of the true and original Weatherbury band, venerable worm-eaten instruments which had celebrated in their own persons the victories of Marlborough under the fingers of the forefathers of those who play them now. The performers came forward and marched up to the front. "Those bright boys, Mark, Clark, and Jan, are at the bottom of all this," said Oak. "Come in, souls, and have something to eat and drink with me and my wife." "Not to-night," said Mr. Clark, with evident self-denial. "Thank ye all the same, but we'll call at a more seemly time. However, we couldn't think of letting the day pass without a note of admiration of some sort. If you could send a drop of somewhat down to Warren's, why, so 'tis. Here's long life and happiness to neighbour Oak and his comely bride." Thank ye all," said Gabriel. "A bit and a drop shall be sent to Warren's for ye at once. I had a thought that we might be very likely to get a salute of some sort from our old friends, and I was saying so to my wife but now." "Faith," said Coggan in a critical tone, turning to his companions, "the man have learned to say my wife in a wonderful natural way, considering how youthful he is in wedlock as yet, neighbours all? I never heard a skilful old married feller of 20 years' standing pipe 'my wife' in a more used note than 'a did," said Jacob Smallbury. "It might have been a little more truer to nature if it had been spoke a little chillier, but that wasn't to be expected just now." "That improvement will come with time," said Jan, twirling his eye. Then Oak laughed, and Bathsheba smiled, for she never laughed readily now, and their friends turned to go. "Yes, I suppose that's the size of it," said Joseph Poorgrass, with a cheerful sigh as they moved away. "And I wish him joy o'er, though I were once or twice upon saying to-day with holy Hosea, in my scripture manner, which is my second nature, 'Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone.' But since 'tis as 'tis, why, it might have been worse, and I feel my thanks accordingly." End of Far from the Madding Crowd. Recording by Tig Hines.